Usually, when you open up a cold case file, you're hunting for a single anomaly, right? You're looking for that one fingerprint where it shouldn't be, or a timeline that's off by maybe 10 minutes.
Right, yeah. Or a motive that just doesn't quite fit the suspect.
Exactly. It's almost always a localized puzzle, a room, a house, maybe at most a city block. But I want you to imagine for a second that you are handed a case file and the crime scene you have to investigate isn't a room, it isn't a building. The crime scene is an entire country.
Which completely breaks the standard investigative framework. I mean, when the geography of the crime is a whole nation, you are no longer searching for hidden evidence. You are drowning in it.
Yeah.
Every street corner, every church, every radio broadcast, it all becomes a piece of the puzzle.
And that is exactly where we are taking you today. You, as the listener, are stepping into a true crime scenario on a scale that frankly just defies human comprehension. Our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the chilling anatomy of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda.
Yeah, we're looking at a period of roughly 100 days. And during that time, up to 1 million people were murdered.
1 million people. And to really understand a tragedy of that massive magnitude, we need a very specific approach to the evidence.
Right. We have to divide our investigation logically.
So we're going to spend the vast majority of our time today, probably about 70% of this deep dive, dissecting the actual mechanics of this state-sponsored slaughter. Because if you read through these case files, the most disturbing realization isn't just the sheer catastrophic number of the dead.
No, it's the cold, hard fact that this was not a spontaneous eruption of violence.
Not at all. It was premeditated, highly organized, and deeply bureaucratic.
It is an extermination project managed like a corporate rollout. I mean, the primary murder weapons weren't just firearms or bombs.
No, the weapons of choice were agricultural machetes, pop music radio broadcasts, national ID cards, and horrifically weaponized viruses.
Yeah, we are going to look at how everyday items were just completely turned into tools of mass death.
And then, for the final 30% of our dive, we are going to pivot. We are going to look at the deeply flawed legal afterthought. Because, you know, if you have 1 million dead, you have hundreds of thousands of suspects.
Which begs the question, how does any justice system, domestic or international, process 1 million killers?
Right. And to do all this, we are relying on a massive stack of source material. We've got declassified United Nations cables, extensive archives from Human Rights Watch, detailed historical analysis, and the actual trial records from international tribunals.
So let's open the file.
Let's do it. Before we look at the 100 Days of Murder, we have to look at the paper trail. Because you don't just wake up one morning and convince hundreds of thousands of people to murder their neighbors.
No, there is an ideological and bureaucratic groundwork that has to be laid. And in this case, it was laid decades before the first roadblock was ever put up.
Exactly. To understand the blueprint of this massacre, you have to look at the mechanism of categorization. If you ask the average person about the Rwandan genocide, they often assume that the Hutu and the Tutsi had been locked in some, ancient, intractable blood feud for thousands of years.
Right, but the historical record tells a completely different story.
And I think that's a crucial point to establish early on. We tend to project our modern understanding of rigid racial identities backward into history. What did the pre-colonial reality actually look like?
Well, in the pre-colonial era, the people of Rwanda, the Banyarwanda, were incredibly cohesive. They shared a single common language, Kinyarwanda.
Okay.
They shared the same religious practices and customs. They literally lived on the same hills, intermarried, and fought in the same armies. The distinction between Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa was not a rigid ethnic or racial boundary.
So what was it there?
It was predominantly an occupational and class distinction.
Meaning it was more about what you did for a living than your genetics?
Precisely. Tutsis were generally cattle herders. And because cattle were the primary source of wealth, they often occupied roles as soldiers and administrators. Hutus were primarily agricultural farmers.
Got it.
And the key here is that there was a high degree of social fluidity.
Meaning you could move between the groups, like upward mobility.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. The mechanism was wealth accumulation. If a Hutu farmer acquired enough wealth, specifically, if he acquired enough cattle, he could essentially become Tutsi. He would rise in social status.
Wow.
Conversely, a Tutsi who lost their cattle could become Hutu. The lines were highly permeable.
But then the European colonizers arrive. Specifically, the Belgian administration takes over the mandate of Rwanda after World War I, and they bring with them a very 1930s European obsession with eugenics and scientific racism.
That is the pivotal turning point right there.
Yeah.
The Belgian authorities looked at this complex, fluid society and decided they needed to categorize it for administrative efficiency.
Right, because colonizers love efficiency.
Exactly. They needed a local ruling class to act as proxies for the colonial government. So they looked at the Tutsis, who were already somewhat of an aristocracy, and decided to elevate them permanently over the Hutu majority.
But how do you enforce a permanent division in a society where the lines are naturally blurry? Like, they speak the same language and intermarry.
You invent a permanent label. You mandate it. In the early 1930s, the Belgians introduced a policy that would, decades later, prove absolutely fatal.
The ID cards.
Yes. They required every citizen to carry a mandatory national identification card. And on this card, your identity was rigidly and permanently classified as either Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. The fluidity was erased overnight.
And if you're listening to this and wondering how the Belgians decided who got which label, given that the group shared so much, it wasn't based on self-identification.
No, not at all. It was based on a truly bizarre and dehumanizing mix of occupational wealth and pseudoscientific measurement. They used a census. If you had 10 cows or more, you were stamped as Tutsi.
10 cows. Just an arbitrary number.
Right. If you had fewer than 10 cows, you were stamped Hutu. But it got much darker. The colonial administrators actually brought in calipers.
Wait, calipers, like physically measuring people's faces?
Literally measuring people's noses, the distance between their eyes and their overall height. They were trying to scientifically prove that the Tutsis were a more Caucasian or Hamitic race.
That is so messed up.
It is.
Oh.
They framed them as superior while subjugating the Hutus as an inferior indigenous class.
It is the insertion of a bureaucratic poison into the bloodstream of a country. They took an economic class system, froze it in place with a piece of paper, and layered a devastating racial hierarchy right on top of it.
Yeah.
And this is where the cold case file gets incredibly dark. Because if we fast forward to the genocide in April 1994, those very same ID cards, introduced by a European colonial power 60 years prior, became the primary tool for organizing the slaughter.
They became a literal death warrant. During the 100 days, extremist Hutu militias set up roadblocks on nearly every street corner and rural path across the country. And the mechanism of the roadblock was entirely dependent on that colonial ID card.
Because, again, you couldn't always tell who was who just by looking at them.
Right. So the militias demanded to see your papers. If your ID card said Tutsi, you were pulled out of your car or stalked on the road and murdered on the spot.
It is a stunning example of long-term bureaucratic weaponization. Imagine walking around for decades with a government document in your pocket that you need to get a job or, go to school or travel.
Yeah.
And then, virtually overnight, that exact same document becomes the sole piece of evidence used to execute you. It's like a government pre-tagging victims for a future crime scene decades in advance.
The tragic irony is that the extremists were so dedicated to this manufactured classification that they even started killing based on those old physical stereotypes.
What do you mean?
Well, the authorities claimed that there were people with Tutsi features who were secretly holding Hutu ID cards. So if a Hutu at a roadblock happened to be tall or have a narrow nose, the very traits the Belgians had obsessed over, they were often killed anyway.
Accused of being a Tutsi in disguise.
Exactly.
It is a bureaucratic nightmare turned lethal. It shows how a piece of paper can just completely override human empathy. But to execute a slaughter on this scale, using roadblocks and ID cards, you need massive logistical planning. Which brings us to a document in the UN archives that genuinely stops you in your tracks.
Oh, the genocide facts.
Yes. It's known as the genocide facts. Let's set the scene for the listener. It is January 11th, 1994. We are roughly 3 months before the genocide officially begins.
Right.
General Romeo Dallaire is the force commander of the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda, known as UNAMIR. He sends a high-priority encrypted cable directly to United Nations headquarters in New York. What exactly is in this fax?
Dallaire is reporting that he has made contact with a top-level informant. This informant, known as Jean-Pierre Terrasins, was not some low-level operative.
No.
He was a high-ranking instructor for the Interahamwe, which was the primary Hutu extremist militia. And what Terrasins laid out for the UN commander was a highly detailed blueprint for mass murder.
He didn't just offer vague warnings, he gave them the actual math.
He did. Terrasins revealed that he had been ordered to register all the Tutsis living in the capital city of Kigali. He explicitly stated that he suspected this registration was for their eventual extermination.
A kill list.
Yes. Furthermore, he detailed how the militias were being systematically trained in combat tactics, and he provided an absolutely terrifying metric. He claimed his personnel were capable of killing 1,000 Tutsis every 20 minutes.
If you do the math on that, 1,000 people every 20 minutes, that's 50 people a minute, almost one person every single second. And the International Police Force, the United Nations, is sitting in an office in New York looking at this piece of paper. I mean, in any standard law enforcement scenario, this is the golden ticket.
It's everything you could ask for.
You have an informant from inside the syndicate. You have the hit list. You have the kill rate. And critically, Tourettans gave Dallaire the locations of the hidden weapon caches, the stockpiles of machetes and guns. I have to assume Dallaire is immediately asking for the green light to kick down doors and seize the weapons, right?
That is exactly what he asked for. Dallaire requested immediate authorization from UN headquarters to conduct raids on those specific weapon caches. He wanted to dismantle the logistical capability of the militias before they could distribute the machetes.
And how does the UN respond to a request to stop a documented impending mass slaughter?
They denied it.
Of course they did.
The UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations, which was led at the time by Kofi Annan, sent a response explicitly forbidding Dallaire from taking action.
Walk me through the mechanism of that denial. How does an institution built to maintain global peace justify ignoring a blueprint for extermination?
They used a strict semantic interpretation of their mandate. Annan's office told Dallaire that conducting raids on weapon caches exceeded UNAMER's authorized mission.
How?
Their mandate, as drafted by the Security Council, was strictly to monitor a previously signed peace agreement between the Rwandan government and the Tutsi rebels. It was an observational mandate, not an enforcement one. New York explicitly told Dallaire that he had to be kept on a leash.
On a leash, while a militia prepares to kill 1,000 people every 20 minutes.
It actually gets worse. Headquarters instructed Dallaire to take this intelligence, the fact that the extremist militias were planning a genocide, and share it with the Rwandan president, Juvenal Habyarimana.
Wait, I have to push back on the logic there. They told Dallaire to hand the intelligence over to the head of the very government whose extremist elements were orchestrating the plot.
Yes, they did. They believed that the diplomatic protocol was to pressure the president to rein in his own extremists.
That's insane.
But as we now know, those extremists had deeply infiltrated the military and the political establishment. By refusing to act on granular, actionable intelligence and instead relying on diplomatic formalities, the UN essentially gave the architects of the genocide a green light.
They signaled that the international community would not intervene with force.
Exactly.
It is the ultimate triumph of bureaucracy over moral courage. They chose to let the blueprint sit in a filing cabinet because stopping a murder didn't fit the exact wording of their job description.
Right.
So the blueprints are drawn. The international community has actively decided to look the other way, but a blueprint doesn't swing a machete. A politician in a capital city doesn't physically hack a neighbor to death. How do you bridge that gap?
How do you mobilize the masses?
Right. How do you take a population of farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers and turn them into a mobilized, willing mass of murderers?
You need a psychological trigger. You need to manipulate the collective consciousness of the population. And that brings us to Section 2 of our files, the soundtrack to murder. Specifically, we have to look at the role of RTLM, Radio Television Libre de Mille Collines.
When we think of state-sponsored propaganda, we usually picture something very dry and authoritarian. We picture guys in military uniforms reading long, boring manifestos on state television.
Yeah, totally.
But RTLM wasn't like that at all. It was incredibly insidious because it was disguised as entertainment.
It was a masterclass in the weaponization of mass media. RTLM was established in July 1993, and it was primarily funded by wealthy Hutu elites, most notably the businessman Felicien Kabuga. But they didn't format it like traditional state radio.
No.
They modeled it after modern, popular, Western-style radio stations.
How did that actually sound to a listener tuning in?
It sounded fun. They played the latest, most popular Congolese pop music, which you couldn't hear on the stuffy state radio. The DJs were young, charismatic, and relatable.
Like a morning zoo show?
Exactly. They didn't speak in formal, high-level Kinyarwanda. They used street slang. They made jokes. The format was interactive, encouraging people to call in from their villages. It created a deeply parasocial relationship. To the average Rwandan, RTLM felt like a cool, rebellious community station.
And that's exactly how it bypassed critical thinking. If a stiff politician tells you to hate your neighbor, you might be skeptical. But if your favorite radio DJ, the guy who plays your favorite songs and makes you laugh, casually starts telling you that your neighbor is a threat, it sneaks past your psychological defenses.
It totally does. And the messaging they slipped between the pop songs was pure, concentrated venom. Over months, RTLM systematically dehumanized the Tutsi population. They popularized the term inyenzi, which means cockroaches, and inzoka, meaning snakes.
Which is a classic genocide tactic. You don't tell people to kill human beings. You tell them to exterminate pests.
Right, and they amplified extremist propaganda like the Hutu Ten Commandments. This was a widely circulated document that painted Tutsis not just as a different social group, but as a bloodthirsty existential threat.
Us versus them.
Yeah. The narrative was that the Tutsis were secretly plotting to overthrow the government, reestablish a cruel feudal monarchy, and enslave the Hutu majority. RTLM broadcasted a relentless drumbeat of panic. They are coming for you. They are coming for your land. They are coming for your children.
And we have to look at how this evolved when the actual killing started. Because RTLM didn't just provide background music for the genocide. The case files show they were actively directing traffic at the crime scenes.
The radio station essentially became a tactical command center. Broadcasters like Kantano Habimana would go live on the air and read out highly specific intelligence. He would broadcast the names, the license plate numbers, the makes of cars, and the exact home addresses of targeted Tutsis and moderate Hutus who were trying to flee.
A radio DJ giving out GPS coordinates for a hit squad.
Yes. He would excitedly tell his listeners to go to work, which became the chilling code phrase for murdering people with machetes. He would urge the militias to fill the half-empty graves. It was a horrifying gamification of mass murder, broadcast live to the entire nation.
And who was listening to these broadcasts and executing these orders? We need to look at the physical hit squads.
The primary enforcers on the ground were the youth militias. The most prominent was the Interahamwe, which translates roughly to those who stand together or those who attack together. They were affiliated with the ruling political party. There was also the Impuzamugambi, affiliated with a far-right extremist party.
But these weren't just angry mobs who suddenly decided to riot. They were highly trained.
Very highly trained. The declassified files show that since 1992, these civilian militias have been receiving intensive, systematic military training from the FAR, the official, state-funded Rwandan armed forces.
Wow.
The military taught them combat tactics, how to set up roadblocks, and how to rapidly mobilize. And alongside the training, there was the logistics of the weaponry.
Right, because if you have a massive militia, you have to arm them. And this wasn't a high-tech war.
No, the primary weapon was the machete. By early 1994, hundreds of thousands of machetes had been imported into Rwanda from overseas, ostensibly as agricultural tools.
Just massive crates of them.
Yeah. But they weren't going to farms. They were being stockpiled and quietly distributed through local administrative offices directly to the militia members.
So the powder keg is built, the target lists are drawn, the radio is primed, the machetes are in hand, the UN has looked the other way. All it takes is a spark. And that spark comes on April 6, 1994.
Yes. On the evening of April 6, President Habyarimana is returning to Kigali from peace talks in Tanzania. As his plane approaches the airport, it is shot down by surface-to-air missiles. Everyone on board is killed.
And we should note that to this day, the historical and legal files still debate exactly who fired those missiles. Some investigations point to Tutsi rebels, while others strongly suggest it was Hutu extremists within his own military who felt he was conceding too much in the peace talks.
Right.
But regardless of who pulled the trigger, the result was instantaneous.
The reaction was so incredibly swift that it proves the premeditation. Within hours of the plane crash, the military and the Interahamwe seized total control of the capital. The pre-planned roadblocks went up immediately.
And they didn't start by killing the Tutsis, did they? They started with political house cleaning.
That is a hallmark of this genocide's brutal efficiency. Before they unleashed the civilian slaughter, they systematically assassinated any moderate Hutu politicians, journalists, and civil society leaders who could have potentially opposed them or organized a resistance.
Anyone who could have stopped them.
Yeah. This included assassinating the moderate prime minister, Agathe Uwilingiyimana. Once the political opposition was decapitated, the wholesale, nationwide slaughter of the Tutsi population commenced.
If you're listening to this and trying to process 1 million people murdered in 100 days, I have to ask the question that haunts every single page of these case files.
What's that?
I understand the military doing this. I understand a brainwashed trained youth militia doing this, but the sheer scale of the math, 1 million dead in 3 months, requires massive, overwhelming civilian participation.
It does.
How do ordinary citizens, people who have shared a property line with a Tutsi family for 20 years, who have gone to church with them, suddenly walk next door and hack them to death? How do neighbors turn into monsters, literally overnight?
It is the most chilling psychological reality of this genocide. And you cannot understand it without looking at the architecture of fear and coercion that the state had built. You have to remember what the radio had been telling them for months.
Right.
The propaganda had convinced the Hutu population that they were in a literal kill or be killed scenario. The narrative wasn't just we hate them, it was the Tutsis are coming to murder your children tonight.
Yeah.
If you don't strike first, you will die.
So it is framed in their minds as an extreme form of preemptive self-defense.
Yes, a deeply warped, engineered self-defense. But beyond the psychological manipulation, there was immense, immediate physical coercion. The genocide was organized at the local, hypergranular level. Mayors, local councilors, and community leaders actively ordered their citizens to participate in what they called civil defense, or umuganda, a term that traditionally meant community labor, like clearing brush, but was now twisted to mean clearing out Tutsis.
And what if you were a Hutu who just said no? What if you said, I'm not picking up a machete against my neighbor?
If you refused, you were immediately labeled an accomplice, a traitor to your race.
Yeah.
And the militias would often murder you on the spot, right alongside the Tutsis.
Wow.
The entire rule of law was completely inverted. Murder became your civic duty. Refusing to commit murder became a capital crime. As one of the survivor testimonies in the archive bleakly notes, either you took part in the massacres or you were massacred yourself.
It is the ultimate psychological trap. You are forcibly drafted into a countrywide murder cult, and the penalty for desertion is instant death. Which leads us to the physical reality of the crimes on the ground. We need to open Section 3 of our files, Sanctuaries Turned Slaughterhouses. Because if you are a Tutsi in Rwanda in April 1994, and you realize that your own neighbors and the local police are coming to kill you, where do you go?
You go exactly where human beings have always instinctively gone in times of extreme crisis. You seek sanctuary. You go to the churches, the schools, the local hospitals, and the regional stadiums.
Places that historically represent a boundary of safety. You assume that even in a war, a church is off limits.
Yeah. But the organizers of the genocide didn't just anticipate this instinct, they actively weaponized it. This brings us to a deliberate tactic known as concentration. Throughout the country, local authorities, mayors, and prefects would broadcast messages or tell fleeing Tutsis that they would be protected if they gathered to the local Catholic parish or the sports stadium.
They offered them a false promise of safety.
Because gathering thousands of people in one location simply makes the extermination process more efficient. It was a premeditated trap.
It's sickening.
Why hunt people down hill by hill, house by house, if you can convince them to walk into a central enclosure themselves? Once the Tutsis were concentrated inside these sanctuaries, the authorities would change their posture.
They dropped the act.
Right. They would cut off the water supply to the building, they would cut off the food, they would surround the perimeter with armed military police to ensure no one could escape. And then, when the people inside were weak and trapped, they would send in the Interahamwe militias.
The specifics of these massacre files are incredibly difficult to process, but we have to look at the mechanics of how it was done. Let's look at the case file for Kibungo.
In Kibungo, local authorities gathered approximately 2,800 people in a church center. The militias surrounded it, and over a 4-hour period, they utilized a combination of grenades, machine guns, R4 rockets, and machetes to slaughter the population inside.
Think about the physical exertion and the relentless brutality required to kill nearly 3,000 people in 4 hours, using mostly blunt tools and small arms. Out of those 2,800 people seeking shelter, only about 40 survived.
And that horrific efficiency was repeated across the country. But perhaps the most deeply disturbing case file regarding the subversion of sanctuary is what happened at Nirubo Church. This involves a Catholic priest named Father Athanase Saramba.
I have read a lot of true crime case files, and this specific case breaks every fundamental rule of human decency. It is a betrayal that almost defies language. Walk us through exactly what happened with Father Saramba.
As the genocide escalated, more than 1,500 Tutsis sought refuge in Father Saramba's parish. They went to him because they trusted him. He was their spiritual leader, a man of God. They expected him to negotiate for their lives or at least provide physical sanctuary.
Right, that's his job.
But instead of protecting them, Father Sarama actively colluded with the local extremist authorities.
He didn't just turn a blind eye, he directed the operation.
He did. When the militias arrived and found the church doors locked with the refugees inside, Sarama made a chilling decision. He actually ordered heavy construction bulldozers to be brought to the church grounds. Bulldozers. And he commanded the bulldozer drivers to ram the walls of his own church, systematically knocking the building down and crushing the families hiding inside.
He brought the roof down on his own congregation.
And as the building was collapsing in on itself, Saramba stood by and instructed the militias to use their machetes and rifles to kill any survivors who were trying to crawl out of the rubble.
It expresses a raw, unfathomable evil. You go to a religious figure for sanctuary, a place that is supposed to be protected by God and international norms, and the priest literally directs a bulldozer to crush you. It's the ultimate betrayal of trust.
It really is.
But we have to note that it wasn't just religious sanctuaries that were betrayed. International secular sanctuaries were subverted in equally devastating ways. Look at the official technical school, the ETO, in Kigali.
The ETO is a prime example of the failure of the international community on the ground. Thousands of Tutsis had taken refuge at this school for a very specific reason. A contingent of Belgian UN soldiers was stationed there. The refugees fundamentally believed that the UN blue helmets would act as a human shield, that the militias would not dare attack a UN-guarded compound.
But the UN mandate didn't protect them.
No. On April 11th, following the murder of 10 of their fellow Belgian peacekeepers, which we will discuss shortly, the Belgian government decided to withdraw its troops from Rwanda. The soldiers at the ETO received orders from their command to pack up and evacuate to the airport.
So you have thousands of terrified refugees watching their only line of defense packing their bags.
The refugees begged them to stay. They reportedly laid down in front of the UN vehicles to stop them from leaving. But the soldiers had their orders. They drove their trucks out of the gates, leaving the refugees entirely undefended.
And what happened next?
As soon as the UN trucks rolled away, the Rwandan armed forces and the Interahamwe, who had literally been waiting right outside the perimeter fence, moved in and massacred nearly everyone at the school.
It is an unrelenting physical horror. We are talking about blunt force trauma, grenades, collapsing buildings, and the abandonment of the innocent. But as we transition into the next phase of our investigation, we find that the architects of the genocide utilized a weapon that was even more sinister than a machete or a bulldozer.
Yeah.
They used a weapon designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma and to ensure that the killing continued long after the 100 days ended. We need to unpack the biological warfare of this genocide.
When we talk about biological warfare in this context, we are talking about the systematic, organized use of genocidal rape. The archives from Human Rights Watch and the UN estimate that between 250,000 and 500,000 women were victims of sexual violence during those 100 days.
And if you are listening to this, we need to be extremely clear about how this is legally and historically categorized. Because historically, in many conflicts, rape has been dismissed by military commanders as an unfortunate byproduct of war. It gets brushed off as soldiers simply losing discipline or acting out. That is absolutely not what happened here.
Far from it.
Yeah.
This was a calculated, deliberate military strategy dictated from the top down. The extremist propaganda we discussed earlier specifically targeted Tutsi women. The radio broadcasts and newspapers hypersexualized them, painting them as arrogant seductresses and a fifth column of the enemy who were using their bodies to undermine the Hutu nation.
So the violence was framed as a way of breaking the enemy's foundation.
The explicit intent of the mass rapes was to completely destroy the Tutsi bloodline, to shatter the social fabric of the community, and to inflict the absolute deepest possible physical and psychological humiliation.
It's just devastating.
Women were frequently gang raped in public spaces, sometimes deliberately forced to endure this trauma in front of their own husbands and children, before being sexually mutilated or forced into sexual slavery for the militias.
And as if that isn't horrifying enough to process, the case files reveal an even darker layer of ingenuity. The extremists didn't just use sexual violence as a tool of humiliation, they actively weaponized HIV.
This is perhaps one of the most chilling strategic details in the entire historical record. We know that prior to the genocide, the HIV infection rate in the region was already a significant public health crisis. The organizers of the genocide recognized this as an opportunity.
An opportunity.
Yes. Extremist leaders deliberately went into the local hospitals and released hundreds of male patients who were known to be suffering from advanced stages of AIDS.
They took terminal patients and formed them into what were essentially biological strike teams, rape squads.
Exactly. The militias explicitly directed these HIV-positive men to rape Tutsi women with the specific intent of infecting them with the virus. The stated goal, which was recorded in multiple survivor testimonies and later trial records, was to ensure that even if these women somehow survived the immediate machete attacks, they would suffer a slow, inexorable death.
I want to pause here because we really need to analyze the dark, twisted brilliance of this crime. If a militia member shoots someone or strikes them with a machete, the crime is over in a matter of seconds. But by weaponizing a terminal virus, the architects engineered a murder weapon that continues to execute its victims for years, even decades after the 100 days of the genocide officially ended.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
We have data on this. A 2001 study, conducted 7 years after the genocide, showed that 67% of the genocide rape survivors who were tested were HIV positive.
That is an astronomically high infection rate, and it was entirely by design.
It completely complicates how we, as investigators or historians, define when a crime actually stops. If you look at a history book, it says the Rwandan genocide ended in July 1994. But for these women, the murder was a slow-motion execution that dragged on into the late 90s, the 2000s, and beyond. The crime didn't stop, it just mutated in their bloodstream.
And it created a compounding, multi-generational tragedy. Because of the intense cultural stigma surrounding both rape and HIV in Rwandan society at the time, these survivors were often completely isolated.
Left on their own.
Husbands abandoned them, they lost access to their land and their livelihoods. So you have a survivor dealing with catastrophic physical trauma, coping with a terminal illness in a region where life-saving antiretroviral drugs were largely unavailable or unaffordable at the time, and facing total social ostracization. The public health crisis generated by this specific genocidal tactic was devastating.
So let's pull back and look at the whole board. We have a countrywide crime scene. We have bureaucratic lists of victims drawn up from colonial ID cards. We have a pop music radio station acting as a tactical command center directing hit squads.
Yeah.
We have priests bringing bulldozers down on their own churches. And we have weaponized viruses executing people in slow motion. Up to 1 million people are dying in broad daylight. The most obvious, screaming question any investigator or listener has to ask is, where were the cops?
Right.
Where was the international community while this meticulously planned slaughter was broadcast on global television?
That brings us to Section 5 of our files, the complicit bystanders and the global paralysis that defined those months. To understand why the world watched and did nothing, you have to understand the semantic and legal games played by the United States and the United Nations.
Semantic games. While hundreds of thousands of people are being hacked to death, diplomats are arguing over vocabulary words.
Yes. Behind closed doors in Washington, D.C., and in the UN Security Council chambers in New York, high-level politicians and diplomats were performing extraordinary intellectual gymnastics to avoid using one specific, legally binding word, genocide.
If you look at the declassified memos from the Clinton White House during this period, it is maddening. The State Department explicitly instructed their press spokespeople not to call the events in Rwanda a genocide. Instead, they repeatedly used the phrase acts of genocide. If you're listening, you might wonder what the difference is. Why play that specific game?
It all comes down to the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This convention was drafted after the Holocaust, and it has a very specific legal trigger. If the United States, or the UN Security Council as a body, formally acknowledged that a full-fledged genocide was actively occurring, they were legally obligated under international law to intervene forcefully and stop it.
It forces their hand.
Exactly. By using terms like tribal conflict, ancient ethnic hatreds, or acts of genocide, they provided themselves with a legal loophole. They could publicly wring their hands and express concern while legally justifying their decision to do absolutely nothing. It was a calculated policy of non-intervention wrapped in diplomatic jargon.
It is the ultimate form of bureaucratic cowardice. It is literally changing the label on the outside of the file folder just so you don't have to take the case. But what about the UN forces that were actually on the ground? We already discussed how General Dallaire's fax was ignored in January, but once the killing started in April, why didn't his troops intervene?
We touched on this earlier with the withdrawal from the ETO school. But the catalyst for the UN's paralysis was a highly calculated provocation by the extremist militias on the very first day of the genocide.
What did they do?
On April 7th, 10 Belgian UN peacekeepers who had been assigned to protect the moderate Rwandan prime minister were surrounded, disarmed by Rwandan government soldiers, taken to a military base called Camp Kigali, brutally tortured and murdered.
And this wasn't just random mob violence against foreigners. The extremists who ordered this knew exactly how the West would react.
They understood Western political psychology perfectly. The extremists knew that Western nations have an incredibly low tolerance for taking casualties in peacekeeping missions that don't involve their own vital national interests.
Especially at that time.
Remember the geopolitical context. This happened only 6 months after the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia, where American soldiers were killed and dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, which resulted in a swift and humiliating U.S. withdrawal. The Rwandan extremists gambled. They calculated that if they killed the Belgians, who were the best equipped, most highly trained troops in Delair's entire force, the UN would lose its nerve, cut its losses, and run.
And the gamble paid off perfectly for the killers.
It did. The murder of those 10 peacekeepers sent shockwaves through Brussels and New York. Within a week, the Belgian government lobbied heavily for a total pullout of its forces. And shortly after, the UN Security Council passed a resolution drastically reducing the entire UNAMIR force from over 2,500 troops down to a token presence of just 270 personnel.
They essentially abandoned Rwanda to the killers. They packed up and left Dallaire with a skeleton crew to watch a country burn. Now, while we are talking about the international response, we also have to address the controversy surrounding France. And as investigators looking at these files, we need to maintain strict objectivity here because international politics deeply muddies the waters of this crime scene, and the narratives are fiercely contested.
Yes, the role of France is one of the most complex and debated aspects of the international response. Before the genocide, France had a long-standing, very close military and political relationship with the Hutu-led government of President Habyarimana. Throughout the early 1990s, France had provided substantial arms, financial support, and military training to the Rwandan army, the same army that later trained the militias as they fought a civil war against the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the Tutsi rebel group.
So there was already a deep entrenched relationship. But the real controversy stems from what France did late in the genocide, in June 1994, when they launched a UN-mandated military intervention called Operation Turquoise.
Correct. As the genocide was raging and as the Tutsi rebel forces, the RPF, were advancing and beginning to defeat the genocidal government, France intervened. They deployed troops to establish a safe humanitarian zone in the southwestern corner of Rwanda.
On paper, a safe zone sounds like exactly what was needed. But the legacy of Operation Turquoise is deeply contested. What do the various official reports say?
We have two major conflicting reports that have strained diplomatic relations between Paris and Kigali for decades. In 2021, the French government commissioned its own investigation, known as the Duclair Report. That report concluded that France bore heavy, overwhelming institutional failure for being blind to the preparation of the genocide and for supporting a racist regime. However, it explicitly stopped short of finding France legally complicit, stating there was absolutely no genocidal intent on the part of the French government or military.
Overwhelming failure, but no legal complicity. But the Rwandan government conducted its own investigation, the Muse Report, which painted a very different picture.
The Muse Report argued that France bore significant conscious responsibility and that French officials enabled a foreseeable genocide. The most intense criticism of Operation Turquoise is that while French troops did save some civilian lives within the zone also acted as a protected corridor. Critics and historians point out that this French-controlled corridor allowed the primary architects and perpetrators of the genocide, the Interahamwe militias, the defeated military, and the extremist interim government to safely escape across the border into neighboring Zaire, effectively evading capture by the advancing Tutsi rebel forces.
So depending on how you view the evidence, you have the architects of a genocide using a Western military's humanitarian corridor as a massive getaway car. It just shows how paralyzed, contradictory, and deeply compromised the global response was.
And that mass escape of the killers into Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, completely destabilized the region, setting the stage for decades of horrific regional wars that continue to this very day. But for the purposes of our timeline, the escape into Zaire marks the end of the 100 days. The genocide was finally halted in July 1994, not by the UN or the international community, but because the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the Tutsi rebel army led by Paul Kagame, captured Kigali and the rest of the country, driving the genocidal government out.
The military victory happens. The killing stops. The smoke clears. And now, the newly formed government and the world are left looking at the ashes of 1 million people.
Which brings us to the final 30% of our investigation. We've looked at the blueprint, the weapons, and the bystanders. Now we have to look at the aftermath, Section 6. The legal afterthought? or the justice crisis.
It is, without exaggeration, an unprecedented logistical and legal challenge in the history of global jurisprudence. If you are a true crime enthusiast, you know that the climax of a case is usually the trial. The gavel comes down, the bad guy goes to jail, and order is restored. But let's lay out the logistics of this specific nightmare. You have a newly formed Rwandan government taking over a country that has been completely shattered.
Completely destroyed.
The national banks have been looted and are empty, the infrastructure is destroyed, and the judicial system. It has been physically wiped out. Out of roughly 750 judges operating in Rwanda before the genocide, the vast majority were either murdered because they opposed the extremists or they had fled the country. By 1997, there were exactly 50 lawyers left in the entire country.
50 lawyers for a nation of millions.
50 lawyers. And waiting for those 50 lawyers are 130,000 prisoners accused of participating in the genocide, crammed into prisons that were designed to hold maybe 18,000 people at maximum capacity. It is a mathematical and logistical impossibility.
Someone actually did the math and calculated that if they used the standard Western-style court system, it would take over 200 years to try all the suspects.
So how do you process a countrywide crime scene when you have no judges, no lawyers, and 100,000 suspects?
The response was to create a unique, multi-tiered judicial strategy. They split the caseload based on the hierarchy of the killers. At the very highest level, you had the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, or the ICTR. This was established by the UN Security Council and based in Arusha, Tanzania.
So this is an international court funded by the UN operating outside of Rwanda.
Yes. The ICTR was specifically designed to target the high-level architects, the masterminds who drafted the blueprints. People like Colonel Theoneste Bagasora, who was a top defense ministry official and is widely considered the central operational architect of the genocide, the man who organized the distribution of the machetes, and people like Jean Kambana, who was the prime minister of the extremist interim government during the 100 Days.
Okay, here is where I have to zone in, because if you are listening to this and you follow how justice is supposed to work, this is the core legal friction of this entire cold case. This paradox completely breaks the brain. We are looking at men, Bagasora, Kambanda, who meticulously orchestrated the bureaucratic slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people. Bagasora built the civil defense program that turned farmers into killers. Kambanda drove around the country actively encouraging the massacre.
That is correct. They were the apex of the command structure.
Yet, because they were tried at the international level by a UN-backed tribunal, the maximum penalty they faced was life imprisonment. Because the international community and Western democracies funding the tribunal had largely abolished capital punishment, international law at the ICTR maxed out at putting these masterminds in a European-style prison cell.
Yes. Bagasora, Kambanda, and other high-level architects were convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity, and they were sentenced to life in prison. Many served their time in relatively comfortable facilities in Mali or Senegal, with access to medical care, libraries, and communication.
Now contrast that with what was happening inside Rwanda. In the domestic Rwandan courts, which were handling the lower-level killers, the guy who was radicalized by the radio and actually swung the machete at the roadblock, the penalty for a Category 1 genocide conviction was death. Until Rwanda officially abolished the death penalty in 2007, local foot soldiers were facing the firing squad.
Right.
I am approaching this with a very dark skepticism because it makes a mockery of proportionality and justice. How does international law fail so spectacularly? How do the absolute worst mass murderers of the late 20th century, the guys wearing tailored suits who built the blueprint and gave the orders, escape the ultimate punishment, while the illiterate, brainwashed farmer they armed gets a bullet?
It is a profound, deeply uncomfortable paradox. And it perfectly highlights the severe disconnect between modern international human rights law, which prioritizes rehabilitation and the absolute right to life, even for genocidaires, and the raw, desperate need for retributive justice on the ground after an atrocity of this scale. The international community, primarily European nations, simply would not fund or support a UN tribunal that executed people. It violated their domestic laws. So you end up with this bizarre inverted situation where the higher up the chain of command you are, the more comfortable and protected your prison conditions become.
It's infuriating. The mastermind gets a cell with a desk to write his memoirs, and the foot soldier gets a death sentence. It feels like the law protecting its own class.
It is a totally valid and deep criticism of the international tribunal system. However, we also have to acknowledge what the ICTR did achieve, because it established some vital, groundbreaking legal precedents that changed international law forever. The most significant example is the Acacia case in 1998.
Tell us about Acacia.
Jean-Paul Acacia was a local mayor, a burgmester, in a commune called Taba. The ICTR indicted him, and during the trial, witness testimony revealed that he had overseen and encouraged the systematic rape of Tutsi women in his municipal building. The tribunal convicted him, and in doing so, for the very first time in the history of international law, the court legally established that rape is a crime against humanity, and crucially, that rape can constitute an act of genocide when it is committed with the specific intent to destroy a group. It formally recognized the biological and psychological warfare we discussed earlier.
Which is undeniably a landmark ruling. It finally put sexual violence on the same legal tier as physical murder in international law. But as important as the ICPR was for establishing legal definitions, it was incredibly slow and expensive. Over 2 decades of operation, the ICTR only indicted 93 individuals. That does not solve the problem of the 130,000 people rotting in Rwandan jails awaiting trial. How did Rwanda handle the actual masses?
To handle that massive, crushing backlog of ordinary killers, accomplices, and looters, the Rwandan government took a radical, unprecedented step in 2002. They instituted the Gacaca courts.
Gacaca translates roughly to justice on the grass, right?
Exactly. It was a modernized, massive adaptation of a traditional, pre-colonial Rwandan method of communal dispute resolution. Because there were no professional lawyers or judges available, the system relied on the communities themselves. Communities across the country elected people of integrity, known in Kinyarwanda as inyangamugayo, to act as judges. Once a week, an entire village would literally gather together, often sitting on the grass under a tree or in a marketplace.
Paint a picture of how a trial actually worked in that setting.
The accused prisoners, wearing pink prison uniforms, would be brought out into the center of the community, and there were no prosecutors reading formal charges. Instead, survivors from that very village would stand up in front of their neighbors and voice their accusations directly to the person who armed them. They would say, "I saw you kill my husband," or "I saw you steal my cows."
If you look at this from a strict Western legal perspective, it sounds completely chaotic. There is no cross-examination by a defense attorney, no formal rules of evidence. What was the trade-off here? Why do this?
It was a massive, calculated trade-off. The primary goal of Gacaca wasn't just punishment, it was finding the truth and emptying the prisons. The accused were heavily encouraged to confess and show remorse. If they gave a full confession and implicated others, they received drastically reduced sentences. Many of these sentences involved community service, like rebuilding the homes they had destroyed rather than prison time. And the sheer volume of cases they handled is staggering. This grassroots system processed nearly 2 million cases in 10 years.
2 million cases. That is a judicial assembly line.
It achieved things a formal, Western-style court never could have. It allowed for a massive public record of truth-telling. And crucially, because confessions were incentivized, the accused often revealed where they had dumped the bodies of the victims. For thousands of survivors, Gacaca was the only way they were finally able to locate the remains of their families and give them a proper burial.
But the criticisms of this system are also incredibly heavy.
Very heavy and fiercely debated. International human rights organizations pointed out the severe lack of legal protections for the accused. There were no defense lawyers to protect against false accusations, and there was no right of appeal to the regular court system. Furthermore, there were major issues with witness intimidation. We have documented cases where survivors were murdered in their villages just days before they were scheduled to testify at a Gacaca hearing because the accused killers wanted to silence them.
And there's also the criticism of what is often called victor's justice.
Yes, this is perhaps the most sensitive political issue. The Gacaca courts were strictly legally limited to trying crimes of the genocide committed against the Tutsi. They explicitly did not have the jurisdiction to try alleged war crimes, retaliatory killings, or massacres that were allegedly committed by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the current ruling party, as they fought their way across the country to end the genocide.
As investigators, we have to maintain our impartiality here, but that is a highly significant point. If a country sets up a massive court system that is only allowed to look at one side of the historical ledger, no matter how unimaginably unbalanced that ledger is due to the genocide, it leaves historical wounds open. It creates a narrative that some victims are legally recognized and others are ignored.
And managing those historical wounds, managing the narrative of what happened, is the defining challenge of the modern Rwandan state today. The Rwandan government's absolute core focus over the last 3 decades has been enforcing national unification and stability under the banner of One Rwanda.
It's an attempt to erase the labels. They're trying to undo what the Belgians did in the 1930s. The message is there are no more Hutus, there are no more Tutsi, there are just Rwandans.
Exactly. And to enforce this unification, the government has passed incredibly strict laws against genocide ideology and sectarianism. Under the modern Rwandan constitution, revisionism, negationism, or the trivialization of the genocide are very serious criminal offenses that carry heavy prison sentences. The government argues, with the trauma of 1994 as their primary evidence, that these laws are absolutely necessary. They argue you have to strictly police speech to prevent a recurrence of hate speech, to ensure that the virulent ideology of RTLM and the Interahamwe can never, ever take root again.
It is the idea that if words can cause 1 million deaths, then words must be heavily regulated. But as you'd expect, international human rights groups and political opposition argue the exact opposite.
Organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch argue that these laws are written so broadly that they have a massive chilling effect on political freedom and free speech. They point out that prominent opposition politicians, journalists, and critics of the current government have been imprisoned on charges of genocide denial or divisionism for making statements that critics view as legitimate political dissent, or simply for trying to discuss the complex, violent history of the civil war that surrounded the genocide.
It's the ultimate tension between state security and individual freedom. When your country has experienced a trauma of this magnitude, a trauma that was quite literally orchestrated through free speech, through newspapers and radio broadcasts, how much free speech can you tolerate before you fear it is becoming a weapon again? How do you balance the memory of the dead with the freedom of the living?
It is a question without an easy or clean answer, and it absolutely defines the political and social reality of Rwanda today.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's step back and look at the totality of what we've unpacked in this massive case file. We have examined a genocide of staggering industrial scale, up to 1 million human beings murdered in 100 days. We have seen how the most ordinary, everyday items were transformed into tools of mass extermination. Colonial ID cards weaponized as death warrants, a fun, interactive pop radio station acting as a tactical command center for hit squads, and the deliberate infection of victims with terminal viruses to ensure a slow generational death.
We have also examined the profound systemic failures of the international system. We saw intelligence like the genocide facts ignored in favor of bureaucratic mandates, diplomatic semantic dodges used to avoid legal obligations, and the withdrawal of well-armed peacekeepers at the exact moment they were needed most.
And finally, we looked at a shattered justice system that tried to reconcile the impossible. It resulted in a fractured world where the high-level architects of the genocide live out their days in European-style cells, protected by international human rights law, while local courts process 2 million cases of lower-level killers sitting on the grass in their home villages. But as we close this file, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. It is something we haven't explicitly discussed yet, but it is a concept that haunts the daily reality of this crime scene today.
What is that final piece?
It has to do with the psychological reality of the survivors right now, today, in modern Rwanda. In the true crime genre, we as an audience are completely obsessed with the idea of closure. We like stories where you find the anomaly, you catch the killer, the judge bangs the gavel, the killer is locked away in a concrete box far away from society, the book is closed, and everyone moves on.
The crime is removed from the community.
Exactly. But consider the math of the Gacaca courts we just discussed. Because of the sheer number of perpetrators and because the community-based sentences focused heavily on confessions and reduced time, hundreds of thousands of convicted killers have served their time. And they didn't go into witness protection. They returned home.
They are back in the exact same villages where they committed the crimes.
Yes. Consider what it means for a survivor to wake up every single day in the hills of Rwanda. They walk down the dirt road to buy groceries, and the person handing them their change at the market is the man who swung the machete at their mother. They share a property line and mend a fence with the person who looted and burned their home. They draw water from the exact same communal well as the person who stood at the roadblock and checked ID cards. In a normal cold case, you solve it, and the nightmare is excised from society. But in a countrywide crime scene where the killers are your neighbors, maybe the formal investigation ends. Maybe the Gacaca courts close down. But the crime never really leaves the neighborhood. It's just there, living right next door, sharing the exact same air.
It forces us to completely redefine what survival actually means, when the diagnostic muddy waters of the crime scene are the very streets you have to walk every single day just to live your life.
Exactly. When the crime scene is your home, the case is never truly closed.